Start telling you a little bit about the Great Depression. We talked about some of this stuff, and then we'll move on to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. Now, you got to remember about the 1920s. By 1922, the economy of this country was really kicking into high gear. And between 1922 and the fall of 1929, we had things going economically. I mean, things were going good. People were making money. People were spending money. Businesses were making good profits, which meant they were making a lot of product, which meant they had a lot of people employed, which meant that banks were doing well and railroads were doing well, that were transporting these supplies from factories to businesses. So I mean, if you look at the whole picture from 1922 to the fall of 1929, banks were doing great, businesses were doing great, factories were doing great, railroads were doing great. No, not very many people were unemployed. Things were awesome. People were making money. Okay, it was a very good decade until the fall of 1929, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. The stock market was on fire. People were making big time money in the stock market. Now, I've never been gutsy enough to get into the stock market because it's a little bit more of a gamble. So when I take my money that I put into my retirement and I go down and talk to John Shaw at Ameriprise Financial, he says to me, "But how risky do you want to be? What type of risk do you want to take? A low risk, a medium risk, a high risk?" If I say I want to take a high risk, then he'd put a lot of my money into the stock market. But I don't know that much about it and I don't trust it that much, so I have him do kind of medium risks. Well, the stock market's a huge risk because you can put money in there and make it, but you can lose it as fast as you make it, okay? And people were pretty confident, though, in the stock market from 1922 through the fall of 1929. They were so confident they were spending money they didn't even have. They were going to banks and borrowing money to invest into the stock market. And that's great if you're making money, but if all of a sudden the stock market crashes, then you've lost the money that you put into the stocks, right? And you've lost the money that you borrowed from the bank, and the bank's going to want their payment, okay? And that was a big part of the problem. Now, everything went really well, like I said, from 1922 to October 24th of 1929. And what happened is that we finally figured out in this country on October 24th of 1929 that we were making a lot more goods than we were selling. We had much more supply than demand. And as a result of that, the stock market crashed. And those people that invested their money into the stock market took tremendous losses. They estimated that the stock market crash in the fall of 1929 cost stockholders around $30 billion. That would be almost $446 billion today. That's a ton of money lost like overnight, okay? And so that was huge. Now, when these American stockholders lost money and went broke, what happened to the banks that they owed money to? They went belly up too. And when the banks went belly up, a lot of other things went belly up. Businesses went belly up because nobody was buying anything from them because they had no money. Well, then factories go belly up because they're no longer selling any supplies to the businesses and they're already overstocked. Then railroads go belly up because they're the ones that are transporting goods from factories to businesses. It's a huge domino effect. And the biggest problem we had that kind of led to all this when the stock market crashed was unemployment. Unemployment, people out of work. Now, I think this is a pretty amazing statistic when you think about it. So, by the end of 1929, by the end of December of 1921, after the fall of the stock market, there were approximately 650,000 men unemployed in this country. Again, by the end of 1929, by the end of December of 1929, after the stock market bust, there were approximately 650,000 men out of work. Now, by the election of 1932, by the time that ended, in November of 1932, that number rose from 650,000 to 12 million. 12 million people out of work. And somebody's going to get elected president in 1932, and we all know that's going to be Franklin Roosevelt. From the time he's elected in November of 1932 until he takes office in March of 1933, that number goes from 12 million to 14 million. So when he takes over the presidency, he's got 14 million people out of work. He's got banks going under, businesses going under, factories going under, railroads going under. This country is in tough shape after the Depression. Really tough shape. Now, historians will give 3 reasons why the stock market crashed, causing the Great Depression. We talked about some of these in class. The first reason was that after World War I, we decided that we were going to start taxing these European countries heavily to bring their goods into America. And we continued to produce and produce and produce, thinking that they were going to say, okay, that's all right, we're buying. Well, they quit buying. And all of a sudden, we had more supply than demand. We had more products than we were selling. That's one reason why we had a stock market crash, which led to the Great Depression. We got a little greedy and started taxing these countries in Europe after World War I. And they got to the point they wouldn't buy from us. And we couldn't sell our goods. The second reason why historians give that there was a crash of the stock market and the Great Depression is simply too many people borrowed money from banks. They borrowed money to invest in the stock market. They borrowed money to buy this. They borrowed money to buy that. And when they lost their jobs after this depression, everybody lost. They lost, the banks lost, everybody lost. People just simply borrowed too much money during the decade of the 1920s. And the third reason why historians give for the crash of the stock market and the Great Depression is it's simply part of our American system. What do we do when we have money? Spend it, okay? We make money, we spend it. If I go buy a new $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 pickup, and the payments are $800 a month for 5 years, that's great. As long as I'm making enough money, I can make those $800 a month payments. But as soon as I lose my job, everybody's in trouble. But that's what we do. We earn and we spend. The more we earn in most cases, the more we spend. I made an analogy when my wife and I first started teaching. My first contract was $12,000. This year's contract is a little below $80,000 for me. And I'm not sure I have too much more spending money now than I did then. I just have 2 4-wheelers and a camp trailer and 2 cars and a house and everything else, which I didn't have any of that when I was first started teaching. We just had basically ourselves, okay? So it's part of the American system. Those are the 3 reasons why historians say there was a crash of the stock market and the Great Depression. Who gets held responsible for this thing? Who's going to take the heat on it? President Herbert Hoover. God bless him, he was not a bad man, but he thought this thing would work itself out. And it never did work itself out. So with this upcoming election of 1932, which we're going to talk about in a minute, what Americans are looking for is someone to get us out of the Great Depression. Somebody get them out of trouble. Whoever that person is gets elected, and we know it's FDR. Has he got his hands full? Look at everything he's inheriting. Okay? So that'll take us to our next subtopic, the election of 1932, and we'll tell you how Franklin Roosevelt got himself elected. Wasn't that difficult? Why wasn't it that difficult, Jonathan? Why did Franklin Roosevelt get elected easily?
Because there wasn't much competition.
Why? Who's going to be his competition? You're right there. Who do you think is going to be the Republican nominee for president here? Hoover. They are going to renominate Herbert Hoover, which is really not a great strategy considering the fact that everybody's blaming him for the Great Depression. The Democrats are going to nominate Franklin Roosevelt, who by this time, kiddos, is governor of New York. Okay? What he's done is, remember he ran the election in 1920 with James M. Cox and lost? Well, he's been taking some time off and he got back into politics. We're going to talk about that in a bit. And he got elected governor of New York and it became a prime candidate for the presidency in 1932. So you got current President Hoover for the Republicans, Franklin Roosevelt for the Democrats. Not even close. When the electoral votes were count, Franklin Roosevelt had 472 electoral votes to Hoover's 59. 472 to 59. Landslide victory. Now, I would preface this by saying, as we talk about these elections, keep track of how many electoral votes Franklin Roosevelt accumulates during these 4 elections that he's going to be elected to. It's pretty amazing what the margin of victory is. Now, to make things even better for Roosevelt, and he's going to need this to solve all of our problems, is the Democrats control both houses of Congress. Both the House and the Senate are going to be led by a majority of Democrats, which is Franklin Roosevelt's party. That's going to help him a ton. Well, when Roosevelt gets elected, he promises the American people a, quote, New Deal to pull the nation out of its problems. And he becomes the first president to really name his administration in which people remember. If you ask people, especially older people, your grandparents, what was the name of Roosevelt's administration? I bet you they'd snap off like that. The New Deal. Everybody remembers that. There are still a lot of New Deal Democrats today. In other words, Democrats that believe in the same philosophies that Franklin Roosevelt believed in the 30s and 40s. Franklin Roosevelt called his administration the New Deal. Harry Truman called his the Fair Deal. Dwight Eisenhower called his modern republicanism. John F. Kennedy called his the New Frontier, and Lyndon B. Johnson called his the Great Society, and then it kind of fizzled out into modern times. But there were a time when presidents named their administrations, and Franklin Roosevelt called his the New Deal. Well, before we go on too much, I want to give you a good idea about Franklin Roosevelt, a little bit about him. He had some interesting quirks about him. So we're going to give you a profile on him, tell you a little bit about Franklin Roosevelt. Very popular president. If you look at presidential polls, he always ranks right behind Lincoln and Washington, or Washington and Lincoln, however it goes. He's usually always third. Okay? We'll tell you a little bit about him. First of all, he was born on January 30th of 1882 in Hyde Park, New York. Franklin Roosevelt was born on January 30th of 1882 in Hyde Park, New York. He was the only child of James and Sarah Roosevelt, and both James and Sarah came from very wealthy families, so the Roosevelts never had to worry anything about money. So Franklin Roosevelt was the only child born to James and Sarah Roosevelt, very wealthy families. Now, what was Theodore Roosevelt to him? No. No. Cousin. Okay? A lot of people think they were brothers. They were not. Franklin Roosevelt was an only child. Okay? Now, it's kind of interesting, the age difference between his parents, because when Franklin Roosevelt was born, his father, James, was 53. His mother, Sarah, was 26. So it was almost 30 years between the two. So his dad was 53 when he was born. His mom was just 26. Now, because of their wealth, Franklin Roosevelt was educated under private tutors until he was 14. In other words, he was kind of, quote, homeschooled, but they brought in the best tutors possible for him to learn. So he did not attend any public or private school up until the age of 14. The family brought in private tutors for him, so he's more or less homeschooled with private tutors. Once he turned 14, his family felt like he should be in a more social situation, but they didn't put him in public schools, they put him in private schools from the time he was 14 until he graduated from a private high school in 1900. So at the age of 14, Franklin started attending private schools, and these schools were in Massachusetts, by the way, because they believed that's where the best schools were. So he was sent to Massachusetts to go to private schools from the age of 14 until he graduated private high school in 1900. Now, people will tell you that he was very bright academically, but he was very shy. He had very few close friends. Very few close friends. He was very, very shy. Didn't have a lot of close friends during the time he went to school. So, where did he go to college after he graduated in 1900, do you figure? Under the circumstances of his upbringing. What's that? Which one? Harvard. He went to, very good, he went to Harvard University after graduating from high school and majored in history. He went to Harvard University and majored in history. I'll tell you how smart he was, Bailey Newfer. He graduated just 3 years from Harvard. Very bright. And then he decided to be a lawyer, so he went to Columbia University Law School, which was the top law school probably arguably in the country. So he graduates from Harvard in just 3 years and then goes to Columbia University Law School. Now, backing up a little bit, kiddos, this is what's a little, you'll find this a little strange, because during his time at Harvard University, he began to court, what's that mean? Date, his distant cousin, Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, they weren't like first cousins, they were distant cousins, but it still, I'm sure, seems a little weird to you. But he began to date his distant cousin, Eleanor Roosevelt. That was her name, that was her maiden name. And they finally got engaged in 1903. So during his time at Harvard University, Franklin began to court his distant cousin, Eleanor Roosevelt, and the two became engaged in 1903. Now, any of you kiddos in here only children besides me? Are you an only child? There you go. You know, only children. But only children tend to be a little bit spoiled, usually by, in my case, the mother, in her case, maybe the father. Okay? And when Mrs. Roosevelt found out that her son was planning to marry, it wouldn't have mattered who he was marrying. She wanted no part of that. She did not want to share her son with another woman. She loved her son. That was her pride and joy. And she didn't want another woman in his life. So she decided she would take him on a vacation, a Caribbean cruise vacation, hoping that that would take his mind off Eleanor, and when they got back, he'd change his mind on the marriage. So again, when Franklin told his mother of his plans to marry, she didn't like it. She didn't want to share him with any other woman at the time. And so to try to get his mind off Eleanor, maybe change his mind, she took him on a Caribbean cruise vacation. Unfortunately for Mrs. Roosevelt, didn't work. When they returned, finally Franklin and Eleanor married on March 17th of 1905. So the ploy by mom didn't work very well. Franklin came back, loved Eleanor, and married her on March 17, 1905. Now, a little bit of tidbit here. Eleanor Roosevelt's father did not give away the bride. Who gave away the bride? Very good. Theodore Roosevelt gave away his niece. So during the marriage, Eleanor was given away, not by her father, but by Theodore Roosevelt. So, girls, keep this in mind someday. So the two get married, and what do? They go on their honeymoon. And usually when you get back from your honeymoon, you find a place to live and kind of get your life organized and figure out what you're going to do. So Franklin and Eleanor go on their honeymoon, and while they're on their honeymoon, the mother, Franklin's mother, not only picks out the home for them, but also decorates it and furnishes it with her taste in mind, not anybody else's. So they get back from this honeymoon, they got a house picked out for them, all the furniture and all the inside decorating is done at the mother-in-law's taste. Now, you girls are all sweet kids, and you're going to find a great man someday, and you're going to marry him. And when you get back from your honeymoon, how might you react to your mother-in-law, your new mother-in-law, picking your home and decorating it with everything she thinks she likes? You'd have three choices, wouldn't you? What would be your three choices? Run! That'd be your first choice. Run, man, run! Or you could do what? Not say anything and try to keep the peace, or you could get mad and raise Cain over it. That's your three choices. Okay? Well, she didn't cut and run, and I think she didn't want to get in an argument with a lady as voiceful, so to speak, as Mrs. Roosevelt, so she just kind of said nothing. Rather than argue with her new mother-in-law, she just accepted the arrangement and went on with life. Okay? I'm not sure if that's the best. Probably it was the best under those circumstances. Well, the Roosevelts have a very successful marriage. They end up having 6 children, 5 boys and a girl, all normal, no problems, if that's kind of what you're thinking if you're intermarrying. They were that far distant, right? 5 boys and a girl. It was kind of interesting because their firstborn, Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr., died as an infant in 1909. However, the remaining children lived into the 1970s, 1980s, and the last one died, James, in 1991. So they lived a pretty long life, all those kiddos. Okay? Pretty good lives. Well, we told you that he went to Columbia Law School, and once you complete your degree there, what do you have to do to be a lawyer? You have to pass the bar exam. That would be similar to you kiddos. When you get done with high school, we're going to give you a final exam over everything you covered in high school, and until you pass that exam with a certain percentage, you can't graduate. That's the same thing. When I went to graduate school to get my master's, I had 2 choices. I could write a thesis, a big paper that eventually would probably be turned into a book, or I could take summative examinations. They call them comp examinations, and I had to pass a big final exam over everything I learned in graduate school during the time I was in there. Not easy. It was really a pain, actually. But Franklin Roosevelt, very bright. He had no problem passing the bar exam. He did that in 1907. But he really didn't want to be a lawyer after all that. Wasn't interested in law, so what did he do? No. He went into politics, and he wasn't messing around. He didn't run for mayor of his local town or the legislature in his state or even the House of Representatives. He decided in 1910 he's going to run for the United States Senate. Wasn't screwing around. He was going right for the gold. So he's just 29 years old.